In this special effects makeup tutorial, we're going to go over 3 different techniques on how to build fake cuts, fake wounds, and also fake scars. Starting off, we're going to use liquid latex. Then we're going to move on to one of my favorite mediums to use for special effects makeup, which is a silicone-based compound. This stuff is so great, really flexible, and really it's one of my favorites. It's really a great medium, and there's so many cool things that you can make with it, but it's a bit difficult to work with. Then onto the last, which is going to be using some scar wax, or in this case Synwax, which is just a bit more rigid than regular scar wax. So let's get started. This is the liquid latex that I typically do end up using for a lot of my smaller cuts, wounds, or anything of that sort. Always make sure to do a patch test for liquid latex as well too, because you don't know if you're allergic to any of the different ingredients in it. Since this is a really big container, I don't want to go and use any of the materials that are inside of it unless I put it onto a different surface. I don't really want to cross-contaminate any of that, so I put it onto a metal board. Now, I'm using the back end of a paintbrush just to create this really thin line. This is the first layer of liquid latex that I'm going to put down. Liquid latex dries in layers, so this first layer is going to be pretty thin. After the first layer has slightly dried, I'm going over this with the next, and I'm just putting a very thin amount down to build this up slightly. So this isn't going to be built too high off of my hand. It's only going to have about 3 to 4 layers of liquid latex, but after I put that layer down, I'm cutting some tiny pieces of this string here. I'm using some black string because it's going to look a bit more realistic, and this is going to be more along the lines of what a scar could look like if it still has some stitches in it. So I'm cutting these pieces, and before that layer fully dried, I'm putting these down. I'm also making sure that the end of my paintbrush is slightly wet with some more of the liquid latex. It's just going to make it so much easier for everything to stick in place. So as I'm putting these pieces down, I'm putting just a small amount of that liquid latex over the top of it too, to create that little bit of a bulge to make it look like maybe that portion of where it is just a little bit inflamed, along with also too, just to make it stick a lot easier so it won't really fall off. Then after everything is down, I went over it one more time with one more layer, so in total there are just about 3.5, almost 4 layers of this liquid latex in total. After everything had dried, and it took about 15 minutes for everything to fully dry, I went and powdered it with some translucent setting powder, and this is just going to get some of that shine off of the top of the latex. Latex, when it dries also too, if you don't powder it, it's going to stick to itself if it folds over or you have more latex that is around, or different objects that are also made of latex. After that's been powdered, I'm using some red powdered cosmetic. In this case, I'm using red eyeshadow to go over everything, just to make it look a bit more inflamed, a little bit more angry. The more typical look of a already healed but maybe still aggravated wound that had some stitches in it or still has some stitches in it. There's other different types of coats that you can use for this. You can always add a bit more of an intense red to it with something along the lines of like a oil-based compound or oil-based cosmetic. You can put that on the top and blend it in slightly. This is going to give it a bit more vibrancy as well too, and it's just going to look a lot more realistic. And in the end, you'll have this realistic looking scar that still has stitches in it. Now, liquid latex is pretty easy to go and remove. All you really do is you just pull at it and it should easily come off. Now, keep in mind with liquid latex, if there is hair underneath the surface, it might pull at it, but otherwise, this is a really easy material to remove. On to our next tutorial. We're going to start off with some Prozaid. This is a really strong adhesive that is used for larger prosthetics, smaller prosthetics, things like this, and pretty much anything special effects makeup-wise that you need to hold down. This stuff works great. This is now Silicone Compound. It comes in 2 different jars. One is A and one is B. It is a 50-50 ratio, so even parts of both of them to go and mix. Now to start off, we're going to use some Prozaid. This adhesive is very sticky and it can be kind of hard to remove, but we'll get to that at the end on how to remove it and how to clean everything off. So we're putting down a pretty light layer of this and just spreading it out to where we want to put down our silicone compound after it has hardened, along with also too as you begin to shape and mold it. We're going to wait for this layer to dry, and this is going to be for our base. So after that is down and you're waiting for it to dry, we're going to mix parts A and parts B. If any of A or B gets into the opposite container, it's going to activate everything, so you want to make sure you definitely use the opposite end of a popsicle stick or you use 2 popsicle sticks. Now you really don't need a lot of this material. Since it is a 50-50 ratio, it will be the same amount for both of them, so really you're not taking a bunch from this. I'm using, we'll say, just about a penny's sized amount of both of these, and I'm putting them off to the side so they don't mix, making sure that I put the B cap on the B and also the A cap on the A container. The one that I do end up using for the silicone compound is from the Narrative Cosmetics brand, and they're a company that I did some work with a little bit ago, and really, it's a great product. So now we're going to put some foundation off to the side, and we're going to mix this in with everything after that is down. Make sure to use foundation or cover up that is your skin tone. This is going to be for the base because it does get kind of hard to cosmetize over this if you don't give it a base color. So we're going to mix this together, and you want to mix it for at least 10 to 15 seconds. After this is mixed, it begins to activate, and you only have about 10 minutes to work with this. Keep in mind, once you put it onto your skin, it does warm up pretty quickly. It doesn't get warm though with the product, but it does warm up with the skin, so it might actually take a little bit less than 10 minutes for it to activate. For this special effects makeup cut, we're going to be making a laceration. A laceration is a lot bigger typically than a typical cut. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this silicone compound and put it on both sides and leave a section in the middle that is open. It's going to be slightly hard to work with when you first get this down. It's going to be pretty goopy, it's going to be a little bit runny, but as it starts to set, it's a lot easier to go and work with. So as we're taking this and putting it down lightly, think of it along the lines of almost painting. And as you paint this on, we're going to start to smooth out the sides and the edges. Continue to taper out the edges, and as it's starting to set, you're going to notice that it becomes just slightly less goopy. Once it becomes a little bit less goopy and it's not running off of your sculpting tool, you can start to smooth out some of the edges of this. Smoothing out the edges, take the opposite side of your metal sculpting tool and pull it out very slowly. You want to make it look like it's a raised portion of the surface of the skin and blend out where any of those lines are. Go across and take off any extra material. Do the same thing with the top, and as you get to the center, you can either leave it open or you can always add some of this into the middle and make it look like you have a almost fat-like layer. Normally, when you get cuts like this in actual factual real life, you're going to go through most of the layers of the skin. You're going to maybe go into where some of the fat layer might be, and you might even get to where some of the tendons are, some of where the muscles are. It can get pretty gross. So put some texture into the center with more of the silicone compound before everything fully and totally sets. At the edges as well too, if you want to make it come to a slight point, it's going to make it look a bit more real, and maybe it's going to give it an area where whatever object that caused this kind of tapered off or lifted up and away from the skin. Continue to shape both of the sides, and at this point it should be pretty much fully set. If it's fully set, this really isn't going to be going too far or anywhere. Now we can take some translucent setting powder, go and powder it, take off a bunch of that shine, blend it in a bit more with the flesh tones that are there, and now we can add some red powdered cosmetic again, like I did with the first one. I'm using some red eyeshadow, and I'm going to follow along around the inside along with slightly on the outside. And this material, in comparison to some of the liquid latex, this material can cause kind of a sticky-like surface. But it grips pigment really well, so you don't need a bunch. If you're using something that's along the lines of a powdered pigment, you might get different areas that are a little bit splotchy if you use too much. Now I'm using some water-activated cosmetic in the center of this, and this is a water-activated eyeliner. How this color dries, it looks like actual blood after, and because this is a water-based one, when it dries it's going to leave different areas that are kind of splotched along the lines of what blood would look like out of a wound if it did end up drying at the edges. So I'm filling in the center first. You can see that it's separating slightly, and that's because of the silicone compound that is underneath it. Putting some at the edges, and you can see too that it is kind of pushing it away. And really honestly, this looks so cool when it's dried. It looks really real. But if I wanted a bit more of this intenseness to it, I'm adding some grease paint into the intersection of this. And grease paint is pretty much anything that is just like an oil-based type of cosmetic, which I have some that is red that'll blend really well with all of this other fake blood that I'm adding. This is alcohol activated fake blood that I'm using, and it looks like it's slightly clotted, which just makes this look 10 times more gross and way more realistic. Now I'm just following it up with more of that water-activated eyeliner, filling in some of the different divots, making it slightly darker at the edges, pulling it out just a bit more because I did lose some of that when everything dried, adding just a slight amount more of that alcohol-activated fake blood. And here is what it looks like after everything is done. This looks extremely realistic. It looks like a laceration, and this is really easy to go and do. Now removing this is pretty easy as well too, but here's a close-up look of this. Again, looks pretty real, looks really gross, and all in all, this stuff is just a great medium to work with. So let's remove this now. Now, I've noticed with silicone compound, depending on how much cosmetic you've mixed in with it, it can be a little bit sticky, especially too because I use some Prozaid underneath, which is going to make this a bit difficult to remove, and Prozaid in general can be slightly difficult to remove along with also the stuff that you use to break it down. The silicone compound, very easy to take off, but the Prozaid, not as much. There is a special type of cleanser that is used for it, or you could always use something along the lines of like petroleum jelly. Everything else just will wipe right off, but underneath there's this remover. Let me tell you though, this remover is pretty harsh on the skin. You do want to wait for it to sit for about a minute, but again, it is pretty harsh. You're usually better off using something if you're going to be using this on your face as coconut oil, petroleum jelly, and petroleum-based products because it does break down a lot of these adhesives along with also special effects makeup. This layer can take a while to take off, and you do want to remove it as gently as you possibly can. Now onto Synwax. Synwax is very similar to Scar Wax. The only difference is that this is a firmer type of clay or a firmer type of sculpting medium for special effects. I call it clay because it's pretty much the same exact thing as clay, and because it's firm, it's a lot easier to at least move around, and it does stay on your skin a bit longer than normal Scar Wax would. Plus, it doesn't indent as easily, so once it's on your skin, it's not going to go too far, but still, it is a softer medium, so it can peel off. Synwax works with going and slowly warming it up with your fingers. It's also a good idea at this time before you do get it too moved around in your hands because it will start to stick to things that you use some petroleum jelly or some sort of oil on your fingers. Coconut oil works well, along with also any sort of moisturizer works really well too, just to keep it from sticking to your hands because this stuff is pretty sticky. So what I'm doing is I'm rolling this out into almost like a worm shape. It should be a little bit fatter in the middle and it should taper at the edges. You might have to reduce the size of this because a little bit of this actually goes a very long way. And one of those containers has in general lasted me a couple of months. So I really don't need a lot of this for a lot of the looks that I do. It spreads out. And anyway too, when you're making things that are like simple wounds, simple cuts, you're not going to need a ton that is really raised. So again, I'm using some Prozaid for this, and I'm going to be using this as the base for everything to stick to. On the palm of my hand, it is so much easier to remove this product in comparison to other parts of the body. It's just the way that the skin is on the hand. So I am dabbing this with a paper towel because I don't really need a ton of this. I only need just a very small base. I'm putting this down where everything is going to go. And after that has dried, then we can stick our piece of Synwax down. Make sure it's in place, and it will stick very lightly to the surface there. And we can begin to press it down slightly too, along with also extend the edges and kind of come to just a point. Now we're going to use our finger to slowly blend this into the skin. You can spread this out first too. Just keep in mind, if you didn't have any sort of Vaseline, petroleum jelly, or anything like that on your hands, you might actually pull this. The base of Pros-Aid does keep it in place, but it's not going to fully keep it in place. Now I'm using some petroleum jelly to go and smooth out the edges and really blend it into the skin. I'm using my fingers first to do so, just to get that general shape of what I want it to look like. Then I'm taking this metal sculpting tool, taking those edges, pulling them again, and blending it more into the skin. As I'm blending this, I'm not going to be removing a ton of the product from my hand. I just want to smooth out those edges and make it look flush with my skin and just really, really, really blend it to make it as real as I possibly can. So after that has been pulled out, you want to take off any remainder of petroleum jelly at the edges, take off a lot of that shine, and just remove any extra product that might have been broken down slightly by the petroleum jelly. Petroleum jelly does break this product down slightly, so keep that in mind if you're using it on the surface. It might just leave a bit of product. Now we're going to use some translucent setting powder, tap out our brush, and take off any remainder of that shine that's there, along with also to take off any of that stickiness from the adhesive underneath, because if you don't, if you move your hand around, then you're going to get little fuzzies and stuff stuck on it, and it's just not going to look as real. So now that that has been covered, we can move on to some of our powdered cosmetics. So again, back to that eyeshadow palette. Now we can brush that slightly on the surface and give it just that bit of redness, make it look inflamed, make it look slightly angry. You can always move that redness to the edges as well too. I just want to keep this in the center because I will make a line in a little bit. Now let's stick some staples into our Synwax. I'm taking them, I'm bending them in the middle, and most of these are doubled up with 2 staples just because these are pretty thin. They're a little bit hard to work with if you're only using one, and they're also really hard to separate and not fully and totally bend all the way. So as I'm putting these in place, I'm being very wary of making sure that I don't accidentally hurt myself and only sticking it into the Synwax. Now let's use a metal sculpting tool and draw a line underneath some of those now that we figured out where we want to start putting some of our staples. Underneath some of these portions, you can always leave some of that scar wax or Synwax slightly closed. Then you can follow up in the center with some fake blood. I'm using the same water-activated eyeliner that I had used previously for some of these other ones. And it's just really honestly such an interesting color that it looks pretty realistic to what the color of blood would be in a wound. So just add some of that in place. Continue to add some more staples in there. And after you have all of the staples in place, you can go back and add some fake blood to where all of those holes are from the staples or whatever type of cosmetic you were using for that fake blood color. You can also have this run slightly down the edges. It really depends on how gruesome or how gory you want this to make it look. A lot of the different types of special effects makeup that I do or different fake wounds that I do, I like to make them look a little bit more gruesome, so I had some of that run down slightly. Synwax is pretty cool. It's not a permanent type of special effects makeup. Permanent meaning that you can't really wear it for a ton of time, but you can wear it for a decent amount of time, especially if you cover it with liquid latex. Taking it off is really easy too. Typically, you just use a metal tool, you scrape it off, and then to remove the rest of it, you use some petroleum jelly to break everything else down. If you did use some Pros-Aid, you might need some of the remover. Or you also, too, could use a bit more of a more natural type oil or some more petroleum jelly, and it'll help to remove it and break it down even more. Thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. There are more tutorials that are over on my profile. Take care and have a good one.